First thing I'd like to tell you about Jack that most people miss is he wasn't this dour Scottish Presbyterian image that we get from various books. He didn't go around with a tract in his hand and that kind of thing. He wasn't a Bible basher. He wouldn't pump people full of Christian bits and epithets and so on. He looked, as I said before, like a shabby farmer. But there was something about him that most people don't know, and most people have forgotten perhaps. He was a hugely charming and amusing man. He was full of fun. He enjoyed life to the full. Even when times were really tough, and he went through some really tough times, he enjoyed life. If you were with Jack in a sitting room or in a pub bar or something, you would not be without more than 2 or 3 minutes without roaring with laughter. It's full of great stories, full of fun, always amusing people. But it was a good amusement. He could tell a bawdy joke just like with the rest of them. But for him, the fact that it was bawdy was not supposed to be the funny part. It was the cleverness of the joke. He was a man who was very hard on himself. He believed, for example, that charity was exceptionally important. And his dictum was, you give till it hurts, until you're scared of how much you've given, and then perhaps you might have given enough, but it's unlikely. He did give away huge amounts of money. A lot of his royalties, I think 2/3 of his royalties were given away. He lived in an abject fear of poverty. He'd inherited it from his father, who also had an abject fear of poverty, despite the fact he was a fairly well-to-do lawyer. They were always worrying about winding up in the workhouse. I mean, the workhouse probably ceased to exist just after the First World War. They didn't exist anymore. Jack was still worrying about them in the 1950s, about winding up impoverished and winding up in the workhouse. So was Warney, for that matter. So that was ingrained into them in childhood, and yet he gave away more than he could afford. That was one part of charity. But the other part of charity, which he explains very well in Mere Christianity, by the way, is that we must always expect the best of people. And when we are disappointed because they don't produce the best, then we find out why and make allowances for that. There are huge areas of charity which are completely neglected in today's world. It's the sort of charity that causes Jack to receive a letter from a disabled child who has some kind of brain damage or something, and spend hours formulating a calm, simple, very easy to understand response at that person's level. It was the sort of work that would really have taxed him, but he would do it. He would answer any letter he received. He believed that if someone took the trouble to write to him, they deserved an answer. So young children would write to him, and he would write back on their own level, teaching them all the time. That's part of charity that we lose today. He was civil and polite to people he couldn't stand. He would spend hours listening to a bore who bored him spitless, out of charity. His behavior was constantly charitable. There was an occasion when he was walking through Oxford with a friend, I think it was probably Tolkien. And as they walked through Oxford, this panhandler, the beggar, came up and approached him and said, "Excuse me, I've got any spare change? I haven't had for a week," or whatever. Jack immediately dug his hand deep into his pockets and came out with all of his change and just poured it into this man's outstretched hand. Probably several pounds, which in those days was a lot of money. And as they walked away, the friend said to him, "Jack, you really shouldn't have given that man all that money. He'll only spend it on drink." Jack said, "Well, if I'd kept it, I would have only spent it on drink." He was continually doing things invisibly that were charitable. I was delivering a lecture in somewhere in America, I forget exactly where, talking about this very thing, that there were students whom Jack helped at university, uncounted students that Jack helped at university. And a tall, good-looking, swarthy man stood up and said, "Excuse me, may I have a word?" Of course, and took a microphone down. And he was an Egyptian. And he'd said that his government had sent him over to Oxford University to attend there on a government academic scholarship. And then the government had changed. And although he was inches from his PhD in whatever his subject was, it was some of the sciences, doctor of medicine or something, he was out of money and he was going to have to return to Egypt. I think it was Egypt. And so Jack, hearing this, just went away and made some arrangements. The next morning, a large cheque from a lawyer in London arrived under his door. He had no idea where it came from. It was enough to see him through the next semester, and then cheques kept coming, keeping him going through the whole of his last bits of his university career. It wasn't, he said, until many years later that he discovered that these cheques came from C.S. Lewis. And he said it wasn't until later after that that he discovered that he was one of many to whom this kind of thing happened. Invisibly, anonymously. Jack gave away and supported students who he thought were worthwhile all the time. He was a sort of man who would put himself out to help anyone with any circumstance. I remember one time when we were at the kilns, two little boys came rushing and banging on the door frantically. I went and opened the door, and they shouted, and Jack came with me. There's a dead man up in the woods. And we're scared. So Jack said, well, you toddle off home, I'll take care of it. So Jack put his hat on, got his walking stick, and I went with him at a distance. He said, stay behind me and I'll tell you what to do. We got up there and there was this man's body lying in the grass. In fact, he didn't turn out to be dead at all, he was fast asleep. But he was a young man who was living rough and had obviously been released or got away from some kind of asylum or institution. And so Jack brought him down to the house, gave him a good meal, cups of tea, put 5 or 10 pounds in his pocket and sent him on his way. Now, most people would have called the police and left it at that. When John Donne said, every man's death diminishes me for I'm involved in mankind, Jack took that seriously. If you saw someone in trouble, you helped, because their trouble was your trouble. People used to flock to our home when Jack got well known. Some would write first, some would phone, some would just show up, asking if they could talk to him to get some answers to some problems they might have. And he would spend hours in his study with people. Out in the streets, people would see Jack. Housewives and the local working people would approach him and say, morning, professor, and he'd say, good morning. How are you today? And Jack would say, I'm fine, how are you? Well, me sciatica, and they would go on with the sciatica and the rheumatism for 20 minutes. Jack in a hurry to go somewhere. He would stand and talk. Everything he did reeked of the fact that he was governed by the Holy Spirit of God. He was the finest Christian I've ever met. Still, haven't met a better one. I've met some good ones, but not anybody who exceeded. And I think the reason for this is he knew how far down he had been. He knew how far down he had sunk as a human being before he gave his life to Christ. And I think that those of us who have been low, really low, realize how much we owe for our salvation. And that makes us work harder at it, I think. And Jack was probably the man I met who worked as hard as anyone had ever imagined. Far better Christian than I'll ever be, I'm afraid. I think you'll find that Jack's application of hope comes out not only in his personal life, but not invisibly perhaps much in his personal life, but in his published works. Hope is, in the Christian sense, is constantly looking forward to the world we're going to from here when we leave, those of us who have committed our lives to Christ. And if you look into such works as the Narnian Chronicles, you'll see that the depiction of heaven is very strong in the Narnian Chronicles. Heaven as Jack would have loved it to have been. Now, Jack would be the first to admit that heaven's probably going to be nothing like at all what he wanted it to be, or what he imagined it would be, or what he'd like it to be. But his imaginary view of heaven on a lower level would be Narnia. Narnia before the White Witch took it over, and Narnia after the White Witch took it over in the Golden Age, and so on. And the fact that evil still had to be beaten in Narnia was because it's written in this world. It's a this world fictional piece. But had the evil never got there, we would have been in Narnian heaven, which was in fact Aslan's country at the end of the last battle. So Jack's always looking toward the front. He doesn't look too much at this world. He never read newspapers. He thought Marshal Tito was the king of Greece because he'd never studied politics and had no interest in it at all. His vision in life, toward the end of his life particularly, got further and further ahead of us. He was looking further and further ahead and waiting to go there. He actually went into a coma toward the end of his life at one stage and was in a coma for 4 days, not expected to ever recover, but suddenly he woke up and asked for a cup of tea. And he said later, now I know how Lazarus felt, and how awful it must have been for him to have to come back. I was so close. He was ready to go, but he was looking toward that life of the future. And that's what Christian hope is all about. It's not wishy-washy wanting to go and play harps sitting on a cloud for the rest of eternity. It's looking to the reality of the heavenly life, of which this is a mere, very dim shadow. So his hope was always there. It was always visible in his writings. in his poetry, in everything he wrote, and particularly visible in the way he lived his life. He didn't live trying to achieve success. He did achieve success, but that wasn't his goal. His goal was to bring other people into the looking forward attitude toward the life to be. It was that belief in hope, the Christian virtue of hope, and that experience of it that allowed Jack to be so powerful in those talks, and therefore so powerful in Mere Christianity. He knew very well that there is an appetite in this world that cannot be satisfied. And we have an appetite for sex, and there is sex. We have an appetite for food, and there is food. We have an appetite for wine, and there is wine. But we have an appetite born into us for an experience which most of us only have very rarely in a lifetime. You get into a sudden situation and you're filled with an excitement and a joy that makes you just say, golly, golly, this is wow, and you want it again, but you can never put your finger on how you got it. And that is simply a message from God saying, I've got something waiting for you. That's an appetite we cannot fulfill on this planet, on this earth, this universe. We have to go further forward. If there is an appetite for something, there is always something to fulfill it. It just isn't yet. And that's what allowed Jack to, when he got onto this and understood this, he called it joy, the real joy. When he understood this, it allowed him to be incredibly forthright and explicatory in Mere Christianity in ways which are so easy to understand. These are the Shadowlands. The real color world is yet to come. It started very interestingly, to me anyway. I don't know if everybody else would be interested. But I know my mother, or knew my mother, very well, and her personality and the way she thought. Chad Walsh, who was a professor at Beloit University, had been talking to my mother, old friends, and she had some questions about Christianity because she was lost for a while there. She'd come out of the Communist Party and she'd sort of she started to search for truth, which is something all of us should do, start looking for truth. And she had an experience with God personally. So she then was talking to Chad about this, and Chad said, well, I'll send you a couple of books, one of which I think was Mere Christianity. So my mother read this and came up with a few intellectual questions, which she fired back at Chad. Chad said, look, there's no point in writing to me about this. Write to Lewis. He always answers his mail. Gave him Jack's address at the Kilns. So my mother wrote to him with some questions, and she was utterly delighted, and this is important, utterly delighted when Jack came back with a letter that shot down all of her objections and queries, as he put it, 2 pigeons to a shot. She was delighted to be knocked down so adequately and so simply and so politely by someone with obviously an immense intellect. My mother and Jack shared one huge thing in common. They were both completely isolated on pinnacles of their own academic and intellectual abilities. There was no one in Oxford with a mind to match Jack's. He surrounded himself with the greatest minds he could find, all of the Inklings, for example, but none of them came up to his level of intelligence and intellectual ability. My mother had the same problem in New York. So when these letters came back from a woman that was obviously almost his equal in intelligence, and certainly better read than he was, in vast areas. I mean, she'd read all the stuff he'd read, plus all the American stuff, and Jack hadn't bothered much with the American stuff, I'm afraid to say. But this fired off a correspondence which went for several years. When they finally met in the flesh, of course, they instantly found each other enormously attractive intellectually. My mother wasn't a particularly pretty woman by this stage. She was already fairly ill, though no one knew it at that time. And that shows in a person, one's looks. But this sort of sudden rapport struck because they were both up here on equal level pinnacles. It was as if you were standing on the top of Mount Everest, and just across the way there's another Mount Everest with a woman standing on it, and you're conversing across the top of the valley. So this friendship grew and grew, and eventually the government decided that they were going to toss a lot of us out of England because of some, I think actually, to be honest, it was something to do with the Suez crisis, which was happening at the time. It was kind of, well, the Britons aren't supporting the Americans, so America isn't supporting Britain anymore, so all the American expatriates should leave. Attitude by the Home Office, something like that. Anyway, my mother was given notice that she was going to have to leave the country. And Jack decided that he didn't want his friend to leave the country. So he came up with a ruse. He said, well, we'll just go to the registry office and get married. It won't be a marriage in the eyes of God. It'll just be a formal civil marriage. And that will allow you to take on my nationality and the boys too, and you can live in England. Which in those days was the law, and that's what happened. That's how I am a British subject to this day. and very gladly a subject of Her Majesty Queen, the Queen, I hasten to add, because I have the hugest respect for her. But so we became British, and then the friendship was still going on for quite a while, and then suddenly my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And there's nothing so powerful in stimulating a relationship than the sudden thought that you're going to lose the person you've grown to be fond of. In this case, the approach of Thanatos, the god of death, was going to put a very final end to the friendship. So Jack insisted that my mother come out of the hospital and go to the kilns to die. She was going to be dying any minute. You knew what happened. I told you what happened in the churchyard, but he didn't know that. Something told me I should keep it to myself. And but before that could happen, because they were both committed Christians in the Anglican Church, he decided they had to be married. So he told my mother he was going to marry her, which she was quite delighted to hear before she died. They were going to be married before God. And he asked the Archbishop of Oxford at the time, whose name was Archbishop Carpenter, I think, if this would be allowable, because my mother had been divorced from my father. And the bishop was very rigid to the rules, because he didn't take into account the fact that my mother's marriage to my father was never valid in the first place in the eyes of the Anglican Church, because my father had been married and divorced before, twice, I think. So had he looked a bit deeper, he might have taken a different viewpoint, which would have made me illegitimate, but I've been called a lot of worse things in my time. But he found an old pupil of his, Peter Bide, a very fine Anglican priest. And Peter was asked by Jack if he thought he could marry them, irrespective. And Peter stayed up all night and prayed about this. And the message he got from God was, do it. He told me this many years later. So he went back and he said to Jack, look, I've been praying about this and the Lord has indicated that I should do this marriage for you. Jack said, well, while you're there, would you lay hands on my wife and pray for her healing? He'd had a very good record of this happening in the past. So they did that. She was married to Jack at their bedside when she was dying in the hospital, and then sent home to the kilns to die as husband and wife. And interestingly enough, Peter said after that, as soon as he'd done it, he went to see the Archbishop of Oxford, which wasn't his diocese. I mean, he was under another archbishop altogether. Went to see the Bishop of Oxford, not the Archbishop. And the Bishop of Oxford quite rightly tore strips off him for going outside of all the rules and regulations. Finally, when he'd finished tearing strips off Peter, he said, but my son, I'm very glad you did it. Which took the sting out of it all, because he realized it was the right thing to do. God let him know as well. So these two then were married, and they had the happiest 4 years of their lives. Up until the time I moved to the kilns, we'd lived in upstate New York and then in London, which is horrible. It was grey. London was grey to me always. I mean, the only fun I had really was playing on the bomb sites, which was strictly forbidden. And occasionally you'd hear a distant thump and a couple of kids would get blown up by an unexploded ordnance or something. It was just after the war, of course, in the early 50s. But then we moved to Oxford into a small house for a while, and that was good. But I always had, within about a mile's walk, the kilns, woods, lake, and so forth to play in, because I was always my mother was a friend of Jack's. I was a welcome guest there. And then when we were at school at Dane Court one day in Surrey, in boarding school, we got this letter to say that when we got home for the holidays, we shouldn't go to our house at 10 Old High Street, but we would be going to the kilns to live, because the kilns was my stepfather's home, and our mother was in hospital. We'd been told in the letter that she'd broken her leg. Well, to me, this was wonderful news, because the kilns was my heaven. I mean, this was Narnia on earth to me. And you never knew when there was going to be a fawn popping out from behind the giant horsetails in the marsh, or a centaur gallop off into the woods, in one's mind at least. It was a lovely, lovely place to be for that summer. But when we got home, it all changed, of course, got to the kilns, because the first thing Jack did that first day was take us down to the hospital, and take us into a side room to tell us that, in fact, our mother hadn't just broken her leg, but she was suffering from terminal cancer and was expected to die any moment. So that suddenly put a pall on everything that was beautiful and everything that was glorious and everything that was wonderful about the kilns. I had that experience in the churchyard, and the pall was lifted off again in a sense, because I knew my mother was going to get better, against all odds. So I started to haunt the kilns. I suppose I was the kilns wood and lake, and I was the kind of friendly spirit in a sense of the wood and lake. And at that time we had lots and lots of trespassers who came in, young people who would destroy the place and cut down the trees and throw rubbish, often including each other, into the lake and so on. And when my mother's remission happened, actually, she said, look, Jack, this has got to stop. They're ruining what could be a beautiful, beautiful wood. We need to build a fence. And Jack said, well, we did. We had a fence, earlier before the war, but they took the wire away. If we build another fence, they'll just do the same thing. Mother said, well, if we build a fence and if they cut the wire and steal it, I'll buy a shotgun. She came from the Bronx, remember. So we built the fence, and they did cut the wire and steal it. So she did buy a shotgun, and we built another fence. And it was a little 9mm garden gun. It couldn't really do anybody any harm, but it made a nice bang and a cloud of cordite smoke and pellets patted off the tree. It was great fun, actually. I inherited it later, of course. But very soon after that, having built a new fence and my mother going up there and blasting away in all directions for fun, we didn't have any more trespassers. Not that she shot them all, but they just decided somewhere else was a good place to be. So it regained its enormous beauty and the magic of the place. I mean, on a still summer day up there, even to this day, it's still Narnia for me, 50 years later. It's still Narnia. So I grew up in land where fawns might be expected, where you could see foxes and know they could talk, if you only knew how to understand them. Aslan might even appear if you were exceptionally fortunate, and did in different ways in your life. It was just a heavenly place to grow up. Warnie was one of the last great English gentlemen. He had been a professional soldier all his working life. He had fought in the First World War. He fought in the Second World War, and I believe was one of the last soldiers taken off Dunkirk during that evacuation. At that point, he was then invalided out of the war on medical grounds, and the medical grounds were that he couldn't stay sober anymore. Been in that much combat, I'm not surprised. But he became a binge alcoholic. Now, he was a wonderful, kindly, gentle soul, highly intellectual, extremely well educated, deeply committed Christian, for a year or so at a time. But then he would have a drink and another one, and bang, he would fall into it again. When he was drunk, he was a very different man and not a pleasant character at all. But to me, he was a vital part of the household. I think he understood what it was to be a little boy growing up through teens, probably even better than Jack did. And we got on like a house on fire. We had a whale of a time together, Warnie and I. He was a wonderful man. I loved him dearly. And I hated his disability, but never blamed him for it, if you know what I mean. It was a disease, it was an illness he had. And I remember later on, after Jack died, when my mother died, Warnie hit the bottle for solace. It was his anesthesia. Because he loved my mother as much as Jack did, but in a very different way. I mean, he found her the sister he'd always longed for. And he could talk on the same level with her as Jack could. They got on extremely well together. So he turned to alcohol for anesthesia and wound up in hospital again. And then after Jack died, I never saw Warnie sober again. I walked into his office, his study down at the bottom of the kilns one time. It was in the winter, and I'd just come home from somewhere, I don't know where. I was actually living by that stage at the old vicarage in Horton-cum-Studley. I'd popped in to see him on my way home. I was on my motorbike. And I walked in, he had no answer to the door, of course, because he obviously would have been drunk. Just walked into the house and walked down to the study, and he was sitting there in his big armchair in front of the fire. And it must have just happened as I walked in. The whole of the front of his jacket was on fire because he'd spilt whiskey all down the front of himself and then tried to light a cigarette. So I tried to put it out with my hands, got rather badly burnt, and I grabbed the blanket from the next door chair and threw it over him, got all the fire out. And I was sort of standing there shaking my hands, and he woke up. And he said, "Oh, hello, young fellow, my lad, what are you up to?" And I said, "Well, putting you out at the moment." He said, "Have a drink, lad." I said, "No, thanks." You know, he was such a great old man. He was a terrific guy. And I miss him. I miss them all these years later. But Warnie was a special character. He lived on till 1973, I think, before the alcohol finally got to him and he died of heart failure. Yeah, he's a lovely guy, wonderful man. I don't think I've ever seen a man as shattered by grief as Jack was. We knew it had to happen. You know, we had the sword of Damocles hanging over our head for that 4-year interval. But we knew that the axe of Labrys would fall in the end. And when it did, Jack was just completely knocked sideways. I came back from school to say goodbye, or to attend the funeral, actually. She died by then. And I walked into the common room, and Jack was standing with his left hand on the mantelpiece. I thought he looked as if he'd aged 10 years in the 3 days since I'd last seen him. And I just cried out, "Oh, Jack," and started to cry, and he rushed across the room and put his arms around me, and we stood there for a while. And, I said, well, what do we do now? He said, I suppose we just carry on, which is precisely what we set out to do. So he really understood what pain meant. And that particular pain he dealt with extraordinarily well. He had one problem. He wrote a book about it. Well, he didn't write a book about it. He wrote a journal of what was happening to him. He wanted to understand the changes that were taking place in his psyche and in his soul as a result of this shattering loss. So he wrote a journal, and his friend and mine, Roger Lancelin Green, came down to visit. And Roger said, how are you coping, Jack? And Jack said, well, I'm doing what I always do in stress. I'm writing it all down in pen and ink. I'm keeping a journal of what's happening to me. And Roger said, well, could I possibly read it? And Jack said, yes, of course, and sent me up to his office to get it from the desk drawer. And I gave it to Roger, and Roger read it. The next day he came to breakfast and he said, Jack, I've read this. You absolutely have to publish it. It's going to help so many people through either impending grief or experiencing the grief after someone has died. It's a book that must go out before the public. So Jack, there's a humorous side to this, Jack typed the book up, tidied it up, sent it off to Spencer Curtis Brown, his literary agent in London at the time, with instructions that it was to be sent to a publisher that he'd never used before for Jack's work. So Spencer sent it off to Faber. And at the time on the board of Faber was the poet T.S. Eliot. Now, T.S. Eliot and Jack had become friends, despite the fact that Jack couldn't stand his poetry, because they'd worked together on the revision of the Psalms for the Archbishop of Canterbury. They had become good friends. And Eliot read it and said, just look, we have to publish this, obviously. There's no doubt it needs to be published. But I think you should get the author, Jack, who'd written it under the pen name of Dimidius, which means cut in half, to come up with a better pen name, because I'm sure a lot of people, I know who's written it. I've guessed who's written it. I'm sure a lot of other people will too. So Jack revised the pen name, and it was published under the name of N.W. Clark, which is a kind of Anglo-Saxon pun, because it means no one knows the writer. And the odd thing about it, the interesting thing and amusing thing about this was that friends of Jack, when the book was released under N.W. Clark, called A Grief Observed, would be browsing through Blackwell's or someone. They'd pick up a copy and say, oh, this is interesting. Oh, this will help Jack. And they'd buy a copy and send it to him. We had copies of the book all over the house, about a dozen presents of it. And it wasn't until after Jack died that I decided that we should let it be known that it was C.S. Lewis who wrote it. But many people did, I think, guess at that. So Jack's experience of pain showed one enormous, again, Christian trait. He was in agony, emotional agony at the time of my mother's death, and he never inflicted it on his friends or on anyone else. He kept it to himself. He slipped once, twice he slipped, because I knew that if he started, and he said in Grief Observed he couldn't talk to the boys, that's myself and my brother, about it because we reacted as if he'd said something obscene. And what he didn't quite understand, which is very unusual for Jack, was that we had been brought up, or I had been brought up, I'm going to speak for myself, I'd been brought up as an English schoolboy by that stage. And the one thing that is the most horribly embarrassing experience an English schoolboy can go through is to be seen crying in public. Boys don't cry. That's going out of the window now, thank God. It's taken me 40 years to learn how to cry again. Now, of course, the problem is learning how to stop. But Jack would only slip occasionally. I mean, there was an occasion once where Mrs. Miller, the housekeeper, said something about, wouldn't Mrs. Lewis have loved this? And Jack said, yes, she would, and he burst into floods of tears. And so did I. That was the embarrassing thing. I knew that if we talked about my mother, he would start to cry, and I would start to cry, and it would be horribly embarrassing. But there was another occasion when Jack almost lost it. He kept it together, and it was an amazing incident. They were writing an opera of one of his books. Donald Swann was the composer. I forget who the librettist was. But Jack had a meeting scheduled to meet with Donald and the librettist about some technicalities in the opera. And it was a July day, August day, I think actually, August. Very bright sunshine, beautiful gardens at the Kilns there were in those days. So Jack said, look, it's too lovely a day for us to sit in here. Let's go and walk around the gardens and talk about it. So they did. They walked around the gardens, they strolled through the gardens, they discussed all this technical matter. Finally, when Jack was convinced they'd talked enough, he turned to Donald Swann and he said, well, we seem to have settled everything we need to talk about. You'll have to excuse me, I really must go now. You see, my wife died last night. Blinded by grief, he walked away into the house. I think that's the only time he really let go in front of relative strangers. Normally, he kept his grief to himself. He didn't inflict it on others, not on me, except, of course, the first time we shared our grief together. And that's part of his charity again. I mean, why should other people be put through the suffering he was going through? And in the end, if we live with it long enough, we learn to treasure our grief. Because our grief and the intensity of it and depth of it is the only measure we have of how much we love the one who's gone. And I think Jack learnt that.